as you said, this Zoom session really was designed to give Konstanze and I, as the curators of the exhibit, one last opportunity to reflect on the exhibit before it closes on January 28th. And I hope if you haven't seen the exhibit, you'll try to make it to the Beinecke before it closes. And so we want to offer some brief reflections on what this exhibit was and what it was not. So the exhibit traces efforts to document anti-Jewish violence from the Kishinev Pogrom to the Fortunoff Video Archive. But I want to emphasize that the goal of this exhibit was not to paint some, lack-morose picture of Jewish history as an unending sort of series, litany of suffering and victimhood. Rather, it emphasizes a tradition or traditions of documentation with a focus on the eyewitness, and it represents a remarkable expression of the determination by the Jewish people to record and seek historical redress for injustice. In doing so, this exhibit also dispels a still stubborn myth that Jews and other victims of Nazi persecution were passive or silent. Konstanze and I conceived of this exhibit as an opportunity to place the Fortunoff Video Archive in a larger context of efforts by victims and survivors to document the history and impact of anti-Jewish violence on a personal, communal, and cultural level throughout the 20th century. Of course, providing a complete catalog of eyewitness accounts of anti-Jewish violence from Kishinev to New Haven's video archive is impossible. It's equally impossible to try to describe or generalize the collective experiences of a single survivor in this archive, or survivors in the archive. The archive is simply filled with an enormous variety and complexity. It's impossible to present even one survivor's life in its entirety in an exhibit of this kind. And herein, I would argue, lies perhaps a strength rather than a weakness of this exhibit. It's proof of the diversity and truly the polyphony of voices and ideas held within our archive. And in fact, if you look at the entire exhibit, Yale's collections in general. At the video archive, there are testimonies of Jews and non-Jewish survivors, socialists and Bundists, Zionists and non-Zionists, people who've lost their faith in God during the war, people who gained faith in God. So how do you express this diversity in an exhibit of this kind? And at best, we really could only offer something that's fragmentary. And the visitors, I hope, can and did accept this limitations as Konstanze and I needed to accept them, but we never really stopped struggling or wrestling with these dilemmas. For me, the fragmentary approach and the impossibility to provide a complete, comprehensive depiction of historical events makes this exhibit a very symbolic one. And like the archive itself, it represents a noble but incomplete effort, or better, an effort that is always in progress. On the one hand, the exhibit and the archive are monuments, really monuments to an incredible resilience and determination of survivors and victims who themselves collected, recorded, and shared their stories. On the other, the exhibit is simultaneously an enormous paper and audiovisual monument to the millions who did not survive, and a monument to the 20th century's most tragic collective failure, or better yet, a monument to collective failures, plural. First and foremost, it is an archive and an exhibit about listening and watching, but many survivors, like Martin Schiller, whose testimony is featured in the exhibit, decry the failure of so many who for so long failed to listen to what survivors could tell them. Even during the war, there were clear cries for help, but before it was too late. But again, this failure was not due to the silence of the witnesses who spoke out vehemently, but a failure of the listeners, a failure to heed the warnings, to act both before, during, and after the war. And indeed, survivors like Helen Kottman, who is also included in the exhibit, not only mourn our failure to listen, but our failure to change. In her testimony, Helen says it very clearly: after the war, they will listen. Things will change. People would be different. But to her dismay, despite the enormity of the crimes, despite what Imre Kertész calls, Imre Kertész is also featured in the exhibit, called in his testimony a Zivilisationsbruch, a complete breakdown of civilization, the world has not adequately reconfigured itself or learned. I've seen many survivor testimonies over the year that echo this sentiment, this disbelief that perhaps the greatest horror of the 20th century, to paraphrase Mailer, was the scope of the Holocaust and the paucity of its reverberation. In this way, survivors themselves actually in their testimony recognize the insufficiency of testimony, or say listening alone to change our world. And they're not wrong. Post-war transformation, I think we all can agree, was insufficient. Justice after the war was insufficient. And mass violence against innocent civilians persists. Genocide, ethnic persecution did not end in 1945. I saw this exhibit as a call and a pause to listen. And judging by the number of visitors, many heeded that call. Surely some people will never listen to what survivors can tell us, and others, perhaps they cannot listen right now, but maybe someday they will. So it's a call, but it's also a very public act of commemoration for those who gave testimony and those who were murdered in the ghettos and camps and mass shootings as partisan fighters. But as I mentioned earlier, it's also an act of recognition of this incredible ingenuity of victims and survivors who toiled to document their tragic history under the worst possible conditions. And that brings me to an event that we're holding on January 23rd at the Beinecke. And so I hope you'll join us. The archive will present a concert based on songs that are recounted in the testimonies in our collection. The concert starts at 5 p.m. At the Beinecke. It'll be free and open to the public, and I hope you'll join us. But poetry and song produced during and after the war serve as a key form of documentation of the destruction of European Jewry during the Holocaust, and it's featured prominently in the exhibit. It remains an essential source for all of us as we continue to try to comprehend the impact of this catastrophe. Despite it all, poetry and song were written during the Holocaust in the hiding places, in the ghettos and camps, songs filled with dark humor, songs calling for revenge. And all of this constitutes what Yiddish poet and song collector Shmerka Kaczerginski called the bloody folklore of this war. And if you go down to the downstairs section of the exhibit at the Beinecke, you can see one of Kaczerginski's books featuring songs from the Vilna Ghetto. And it's one of the first collections of this bloody folklore documented for future generations, intent on studying the tragedy of the Holocaust through the creative work of its victims. I'd like to ask Konstanze to say a few words about other poetry featured in the exhibit.
First of all, I would like to say that Kaczerginski's songbook from 1946, which is downstairs, is not the only Yiddish collection, early collection of ghetto and camp songs Yale owns. And during the exhibit, I had a class with students, with a class who learned Yiddish at the time. And we looked together at other poems and songs published in the 1940s from the ghettos and songs. And this was one of my most moving experiences, to see the students read these poems in songs in their original language. So, and of course, poetry as a source of documentation of anti-Jewish violence is not exclusively the domain of the Holocaust or the post-war period, and it's part of a very long tradition, which basically goes back to Eicha, to Lamentations in the Bible, where the destruction of the first temple is mourned. And our exhibit, as you probably know, it begins with a poem written in 1903 by Chaim Nachman Bielik, who was sent by a commission in Kiev to investigate the terrible pogrom which happened in Kishinev in 1903. He interviewed witnesses with very methodically. He did the work of a historian, but he did not publish his reports, he did not publish his interviews, but he wrote a 272-line Hebrew poem, which is learned until today. I learned it when I learned Hebrew, and I just wanted to read the beginning to you. its English translation from the 1920s. Arise and go now to the city of slaughter, into its courtyard wind thy way. There with thine own hand touch, and with the eyes of thine head, behold on tree, on stone, on fence, on mural clay, the splattered blood and dried brain of the dead. Here, at the beginning of the exhibit, Bierlik asks the reader, and we ask the visitor to be witness and to listen to the testimonies in the exhibit. And as Stephen said, we focused also on poems, we focused on songs, and we have 14 songs and poems in the exhibit, among them, for example, also Die Kuppe, the Mount, which was written in the 1920s by Peretz Markesh, the Yiddish poet, in commemoration of the Jewish victims of the pogroms in Ukraine in 1919-1920. We have the poem of Leib Gerst, which was published in one of the displaced persons periodicals. This poem is called Die Sonne scheint nicht für uns, the sun does not shine for us, and expresses the desperation after the liberation, which was in some aspects another phase of suffering. So if you have time to see the exhibit again, I would encourage you to look for these poems and songs. Another poet who captured her experiences and wartime sufferings in verse featured in this exhibit is Renée Hartmann. Blessed be her memory. Renée was born in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, now Slovakia, 1933. Her testimony was one of the first 4 video testimonies recorded by the Fortunoff Archive's predecessor organization in New Haven on May 2, 1979. Renée was born to deaf parents, and her sister Herta, 2 years younger, was born deaf as well. In her testimony, Renée recounts how she served as the ears of her entire family, gathering information and alerting them to any danger. She and her sister survived the camps together and emigrated to the United States via Sweden. Renée joined us for the official opening of the exhibit in September and read 2 of her poems. Sadly, Renée passed away on January 6, 2025. She was a remarkable woman, brilliant, warm, and a loving mother and grandmother, and she was also a librarian. She was a colleague. We would like to share some excerpts of Renée's testimony. She might be gone, but we would like to think that a piece of her will remain with us for eternity in the form of her poetry and her testimony. The first clip is the excerpt included in the exhibit. It's just 2 minutes long.
Later on in Bergen-Belsen, I realized that my sister was being watched by the camp doctor. I do not know who it was. He was a German doctor, but he would come by the children's barracks all the time, come to my sister, pinch her cheeks, pull her ears, and try to be very friendly with her. And then one day he said to me that he would be able to give us oranges and chocolates if I allowed my sister to go into the hospital for a few days. And my sister was perfectly well. So I couldn't understand why he wanted her in the hospital. And I just was very sassy, and I said, no, you are not, because if you are, I'm going to kick you. And I went up and sort of said, I'm really going to, I'm serious, I mean it. And so he laughed and then forgot about it. Later on, the blockade tester told me that he had hoped to be able to use my sister for scientific research. Right across from us was a charnel house filled with corpses, not just inside, but overflowing all over. There were corpses all over. I walked beside dead people. And after a while, it just got to be so that one noticed and one had to say to oneself, I'm not going to see who it is. I'm not going to recognize anyone in this person who is lying there. And it got to the point where I realized that I had to close my eyes to a number of things. And otherwise, I would not have survived even at that time, because I saw people around me going mad. I was not only having to live with all these things, but with madness.
The second clip is from the unedited testimony. And
Which was visual. It was a very strange thing, because not only did I come to the United States, which was visually, humanly, culturally so different from anything I had experienced, the plentifulness that I saw. I remember going through the streets of Brooklyn and seeing the vegetable stands, the food stands. I couldn't believe that there was, after having come to Sweden, where obviously there was no war, but there still were shortages, there were still things on rationing. We come to the United States where everything just was hanging out on the streets, all the food, everything, the ice creams, the things that seemed like such a strange contrast to what I knew. And then to come through an area of New York which was totally Black, where you saw very few white people, and then into Brooklyn, which was Hasidic. It was Williamsburg, where all the religious Jews were. And suddenly I realized, as I was going through it and I was asking all sorts of eager questions, I suddenly realized that this was a very, very strange world. Even not only because of the war, but even because of what happened afterwards. And I had to get used to the peace.
Is it still strange?
Is it still strange to me now?
Strange world?
No.
Anything that's left from that time?
I'm sorry, Mike.
What is left with you from that time?
What is left with me? What is left is the sense that that one can really never totally reconcile cultures, that one does make peace, but it's still the fact of the two cultures that exists in my mind, and I'm sure that in other people who have had experiences like me have, is that the two are two separate units in one's experience. And so that there is the me, that is the wartime and pre-wartime me, and the me that is the post-wartime. It's like having an era before and after. And that while they are all connected in myself, that they are not reconcilable. And it took me a long, long time to realize that not only are they not reconcilable, I don't want them to be reconciled, that I wanted them to be separate, that I wanted this other experience not to get lost. One experience which I haven't talked about was an episode which is the central episode of my life, which was when I was in the camp. I managed to find a roll of toilet paper. And I managed to also barter something I had for a pencil. And I started to write. And I was writing down everything that was happening to me. I was about my longings, my fears, conversations I overheard, things people had said. And at one point, this roll of toilet paper was found in one of the searches by the soldiers. And I remember coming back from their pair, seeing a soldier sitting on the lower bunk from the one I was with the toilet paper and rolling it and reading it to someone else and laughing and finding it very amusing. When I suddenly rushed up to snatch it, he pulled it away and he said, "No, this is too good for you." And he took it with him. And of course, I heard the conversation. I heard what they were describing. One of the things that I remember him saying to the other was, "She has a wonderful sense of humor." And I didn't remember writing anything funny in it.
Thanks, Tobias. So here you see this again, really gets to the heart of the exhibit, this impulse to document, even in under the worst possible conditions. And Renee did continue to write, including publishing a book of poetry titled Wounded Angels. And I'd like to read one of her poems now, titled After the Bombing. The street cried. I saw lintels weep, windows covered their eyes, and doors sway in shame. I saw bricks tremble, fall, exposing the sorrow of their walls. Chimneys moaned, the smoke banked its widening cracks. Every house was a wound. Stairs turned like midnight dancers, lamps swayed in the dreaming air, chairs tumbled, mirrors incandescent, caught light. Drowsy broken stars over shattered beds, a multitude of pots punctuated the plastered heaps and random color of empty clothes. All this I saw again and again. No wonder my eyes are mute. And in a world where bombs and missiles are falling on cities every day, I'm sad to say it seems that Renee's poem is particularly poignant today. The loss of Renee, the fact that none of the founders are with us, the founders of this archive are with us anymore, exemplifies the timelessness of this, the timeliness of this exhibit and the challenge we face in a world where we can no longer rely on in-person exchanges with the living witnesses. In the future, we will need to rely on testimony in written and audiovisual form to get closer to what it was like for those caught in this whirlwind and its aftermath, which is why I would argue this archive and archives like it are more important than ever. Konstanze? You're muted.
Of course, I strongly agree. And I think the exhibit has shown how important it is that people can listen to testimonies and that they can see and these artifacts, these books, these early books, and also their handwritten books, the diaries. And I mentioned the Yiddish the class I had with the Yiddish course, for me, it was so striking how much they took with them with the issue of a displaced person periodical from 1946. And it was also so striking because we looked at the artifact and the artifact was digitized, and every student told me it was so moving to have this artifact in hand, to touch it, to see how it was printed, to see that part of it was not real, that there were no type was not used, but that it was mimeographed, so it was handwritten partly. So this confirmed for me as a librarian also our mission to safeguard and steward this heritage, this cultural heritage and artifacts, and also, of course, the Fortunoff Archive, these testimonies, where you can really encounter the people, the survivors and bystanders. For me, I'm very, very grateful that I could be part of this incredible enterprise. I'm so grateful for the very close collaboration with so many wonderful colleagues who shared their amazing expertise with us. Without this expertise, this exhibit would not have come into being. And I'm also grateful after I gave so far, I think until the end of January, I will have given around 22 tours to visitors, to students, but also to visitors, to colleagues and to visitors from New Haven and all over the world, actually. And I'm so grateful that they shared their thoughts with me. The conversations I had going through the exhibit with visitors and with students, they are among the most precious in the past year. So I'm very grateful for that as well. So thank you.
I can only underscore everything that Konstanze said, and add that, for me, one of the most moving experiences with this exhibit was at the opening in September. We made an effort to invite as many families of the survivors who were featured in the exhibit to attend the opening reception. And as I walked around the reception, which filled with people, everyone talking and kibitzing and looking at the exhibit, to see the families of survivors standing in front of the vitrines, watching their parents, grandparents' testimonies, was a sense of, we really created a space where their family could see that Yale cares about this gift that they've given to the university library, that their testimony matters, their voice, that this institution is dedicated to presenting it in this public forum. And it's a kind of form of recognition. And that's particularly the case for the excerpt we were able to bring the family of Christina Gill, who is a Roma survivor, featured. And so this is really a statement that their story matters. So that was really one of the more moving aspects of the work on this exhibit. And for me, that really made all the work worthwhile.